Thank you, Thomas, and hello everyone. And it's a great pleasure for me actually to be physically here in Guyana, sitting next to Thomas for this event, rather than sitting at the end of a Zoom call somewhere. Today's talk is going to be given by Dr. Samantha Stratton-Short on building resilience in the face of climate change, Guyana. Samantha is Head of Strategic Initiatives, Infrastructure and Project Management in the UN Office for Project Services, and she's got a lot of experience in the past, having started off as an architect, but she's worked for institutions, NGOs and donors, and prior to working for UNOPS, she led Arup's international development in Asia, based in Philippines, focusing on climate resilience and urbanization. So she's clearly got exactly the right experience to talk on what looks to be an extremely important issue in that, as I've been shown over the last few days. Certainly the need here in Guyana, where large parts of the country are effectively below the current sea level and face problems in the future. And it's rumbling with thunder outside, so there's clearly more water coming down onto the land of many waters. With that, without more ado, I'll hand over to Samantha to give her presentation. I look forward after that to a lively discussion. Samantha, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me all right, especially above the thunder. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about building resilience and in the context of Guyana. So I've prepared a presentation which will just start with explaining a bit about UNOPS's role within the UN and how we approach infrastructure, and then reflect on Guyana, and then look at some examples of things that are happening elsewhere, which I think would be quite relevant. And actually, I would think it would be fantastic to have a discussion afterwards and find out more about what are the plans and how are things going to be engaged with going forward. So yeah, just quickly, in terms of UNOPS, so we're the Office of Project Services, and we have a mandate in infrastructure and procurement, and we offer sort of 5 services. So it's infrastructure, procurement, project management, financial management, and human resources. And we work in, I think we have offices in over 80 countries around the world, and more than half of our portfolio is in fragile and conflicted states. So this presents a very interesting challenge, and one where sustainability, resilience, and inclusion is paramount. Yeah, so what we really want to talk about is infrastructure and development. In UNOPS, almost everything is infrastructure to us. And what I mean by that is, if it's education, if it's health, if it's water, we see buildings, we see pipes, we see roads. All of that is infrastructure, but probably most importantly, it's about the services rather than the assets, and that's where we can really build in some of the value. So we've done a lot of work in the past, particularly with the University of Oxford, on defining infrastructure and in the context of the SDGs. And some work we did a couple of years ago actually mapped the SDG targets to different types of infrastructure, so that we could say from a quite systematic perspective that infrastructure can influence 92% of the targets of the SDGs. And this is really important, because what we find is that a lot of people think that infrastructure is just sort of literally the tarmac or the pipes, without understanding that if you do it well, you get, good contribution to the SDGs. And if you do it poorly, then you can actually undermine everything that you're doing. So we've also just last year also published work around climate action and infrastructure. And so using the same methodology, we mapped how infrastructure can influence climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And we found, it's quite, quite stark in terms of infrastructure. We know that the construction industry plays a huge role in contributing to GHG emissions. But if you look at infrastructure even wider than that in terms of its operations as well as its design, its embodied carbon, and that it contributes to 79% of all GHG emissions. But it also will likely account for 88% of all adaptation costs. So there's a lot of potential for infrastructure to really help change and make things for the better. What we have, I'd say what the agenda has typically focused on up until very recently is about the infrastructure investment gap, which we know is significant. It's significant globally. And these numbers are probably familiar to many people in terms of this, $97 trillion needed by 2040, according to the Global Infrastructure Hub. But what we're only just seeing is how much the SDGs, sustainability, climate need to be built into this investment gap. So along the lines of what I was saying is the infrastructure opportunity and the risk is, we can do it well, and we will get fantastic SDG outcomes along, the goals, human rights, the Paris Agreement. But actually, up till now, there have been a lot of risks that have come with building infrastructure. One of the things that UNOPS has been working on with a lot of our multilateral development partners and UN agencies has been on the quality infrastructure principles. So we helped in terms of inputting into what they should be, and we say that we operationalize these quality infrastructure investment principles. And this is really key to having a sort of consistent view of what it means to deliver quality infrastructure. And this is really critical, because when we don't invest in quality infrastructure, we're basically locking in bad decisions for the lifespan of the infrastructure, which could be it depends on how bad it is. It could be 10 years, it could be 60 years. So this is really important. And so to operationalize quality infrastructure, we look at it in terms of 4 pillars. And the first pillar that we look at is strengthening the enabling environment. So we really focus on before you get anywhere near a project, you need to understand what it takes to actually plan, design, and implement good infrastructure systems. Pillar 2 is about prioritizing the right solution. So this is actually making sure that that this is sort of systematically understood. This is strategic planning. Pillar 3 is delivering the right solutions well. So this is about designing well, having the best practice standards, implementing these on the ground well. And pillar 4, which could actually be pillar 1 or pillar 4, is maximizing existing system performance. And so, this could be asset management. But what we're really seeing here is, this is also about, it's about SDG 12, which is, prolonging the lifespan of existing assets, and making them last longer, and therefore saving resources. But it's also about saving a government's resources, and making sure we do things well. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but just to give you a bit more perspective on, so strengthening the enabling environment is where we would look at improving governance, institutions, regulatory instruments to deliver the sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. And as we say, a lot of poor infrastructure governance, it results in the infrastructure spending being wasted, and this can be anywhere from 33 to 50%, which is stark. And we have several ways that we work to support this. A lot of it is capacity building, and we also have actually a capacity assessment tools where we talk to governments about in a very holistic way to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the enabling environment around their infrastructure. Pillar 2, prioritizing the right solution. So this is where we try to have an integrated systems-based approach to decision making. And we have several ways that we engage with governments around this. But one of the ways that has been probably very interesting and successful is work that we've done with the University of Oxford using their NISMOD tool to actually map the infrastructure vulnerabilities and needs going forward, as well as how many people would be involved. I'll explain more about that in terms of some of the case studies that we've done. But this is really tried to create an evidence-based and systems-based approach to looking at your infrastructure systems, which is particularly important for resilience. Pillar 3, delivering the right solutions well. So this is, most of the life cycle costs will be, sort of made or lost in this stage. So this is really important. And UNOPS has actually developed its own standards, processes, and practices and guidance to deliver this based on sort of best practice. And we've developed these so that they are more context sensitive than what we might find out there, which would be excellent. So we use the best practice, but we actually try to sensitize it to the context that we're working in. And finally, the maximizing existing system performance. As I said, the importance of infrastructure maintenance is absolutely critical. Asset assessment, maintenance planning, capacity building in this area, looking at asset management systems. These are all things that are absolutely key to ensuring a sort of, you could say, a healthy infrastructure environment going forward. Okay, so that was a bit of background about what UNOPS does in this area. And then I just wanted to reflect on sort of some of the context of Guyana related to climate and infrastructure resilience, of which probably the audience knows more than I do, but it will be helpful, if nothing else, to see how aligned we are. So in terms of the population, Guyana is just under 800,000. And of course, one of the main concerns is that 90% of the population lives in low-lying coastal regions, probably just above sea level or below sea level. And also in terms of people, there's a high emigration and brain drain. And so it would be, obviously a huge opportunity to keep more people. I think it's from an environmental perspective, it's fascinating that there's 87% of the Amazon rainforest. No, I've got the words in the right way. 87% of Guyana is rainforest. That's the Amazon rainforest, and not that you have 87% of the Amazon rainforest. And obviously very rich in natural resources, and the recently discovered oil and gas, and mining as well. And of course, I think that Guyana is getting the attention of a lot of the world as one of the fastest growing economies at the moment, and some very I'd say, very interesting initiatives in terms of trying to leverage the money coming in to prepare for the future. Without going into detail, I just did this sort of high-level analysis to understand the sort of environmental challenges of Guyana. There's just a legend, which is the arrows on the left are the current situation, the arrows on the right are the estimated future risk. And so we see that flood is going to get worse, drought is going to get worse. Contamination or depletion of fresh water is going to get worse, crop failure, loss of biodiversity. I think hopefully the protection of the forest will help keep that not in a great place, but not deteriorating. And fuel scarcity, which is an interesting one given the export. And then social challenges. We understand that Guyana has a high crime rate, which is probably related to the poverty, which is very important in terms of the climate situation, as that would be the poor that will most likely be in the most vulnerable areas, and therefore this is likely to get worse rather than better if things aren't addressed. And then business regulation is there's definitely room for improvement, which I know that the government is looking at in terms of making it more attractive for investment. So looking at the climate, we can see here some sea level rise maps, and you can see that a lot of the coast of Guyana will be impacted in a quite severe way by sea level rise. And this is projected for up to 2039. So in terms of climate adaptation strategies, I understand that this is a concern for Guyana, and there are lots of projects and plans going on. One of the key challenges, of course, is the coastal area and the sea level rise and the flooding, and with that will come the storm surge. And just from a global perspective, just putting it in that 1.2 billion people could be displaced globally by 2050 due to climate change and natural disasters, which is not far away. And 410 million people will be displaced by sea level rise alone by 2100. And so some of the climate adaptation strategies for that risk alone, sea level rise, are rezoning flood areas, coastal zone management plans, updating the building codes, very much a systems approach to infrastructure. And this is where sort of the modeling of systems is really important, because if you fix one part of the system, it's very likely that another part will fall over in this instance if you don't understand how the whole system is interdependent. And so what many coastal areas are facing at the moment is the idea of planned retreat from at-risk areas. And this planned retreat can take place over, whatever period of time is deemed necessary. And it can come in different stages. So setbacks from shore, leave open areas for recreation or agriculture to absorb storm water, turn streets into canals in coastal cities, but ultimately it's about some form of relocation. And just a couple examples of places that have been dealing with this, and there's actually quite a few now. But you may be aware that Kiribati bought land in Fiji. several years ago to anticipate the significant sea level rise and the fact that they would probably need to completely relocate the inhabitants. Another interesting one is Jakarta, capital city of Indonesia, which is it's not explicitly a planned retreat, but if you know Jakarta, you'll be well aware of the numerous challenges that it's facing in terms of its sinking and the waters rising at the same time, amongst other challenges. And so the government is relocating the capital city as part of a way of dealing with that. But there are many opportunities that we can see for Guyana. It's, it'd be exciting to see what happens to the Natural Resource Fund that, working with the Norwegian government. I think that in terms of looking at analogies with like Dubai, it's bringing in capabilities, bringing in climate resilience capabilities, which is probably not something that Dubai did at the time. That Guyana is already looking at agricultural diversification as an adaptation measure, diversifying the energy mix, so in terms of climate mitigation, and but then again in terms of adaptation, there's a lot of thought and projects being considered for flood protection, and those should be looked at in terms of all different types: nature-based solutions, drainage management, early warning systems, seawall reinforcement, yes, immigration policy. If there will be lots of immigrants coming to work on the new economy, what may not want to follow what Dubai has done or learn from it. Yes, the government's also expressed its intention to tap the carbon credit market to find additional funding for public works projects. I did see reference as well to a climate resilience strategy and action plan for Guyana. However, it's I'd be interested to know afterwards, since it's from 2015, how much has been actioned so far, and also knowing how much that our climate science has advanced as to whether there's been any updates since then. So with that sort of reflection in mind, I wanted to share with you a couple project examples, starting with work that we've done in St. Lucia. And so we did this a few years ago, and St. Lucia, again, small island developing state, also mountainous, makes it very difficult to expand inwards. The population is along the coast as well. It has a high education and life expectancy rates, but also high poverty and unemployment rates. I think one of the interesting things is that it applies about 25% of its capital budget to adaptation. So it takes it really seriously. And as you can see, sort of across the board, except perhaps for earthquakes, their tropical storms will get worse: flooding, landslides, drought, wildfires. All of these things are expected to get worse. And then in terms of climate adaptation strategies, the St. Lucia has been working on a national adaptation plan, which will run through 2028. And it has, many goals in terms of food security, water resources, critical infrastructure, and also the coastal and marine ecosystems, and I'd say capacity building to help sustain this in the long run, and enhancing human health. So what we did with the University of Oxford and the government of St. Lucia was to support their strategic planning and the financing of infrastructure to accelerate their progress towards the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So the first thing that was done was to establish an infrastructure unit within the Ministry of Finance. And this was the National Integrated Planning and Programming Unit, the NIP. And then we worked on a national infrastructure assessment, followed by the infrastructure financing strategy. And you can see the National Integrated Planning and Program Unit was had a mixture of stakeholders. And the idea was to make sure that we had a cross-sectoral and systems view of the of infrastructure for strategic planning. So where we really came in was on the National Infrastructure Assessment and the financing. And the National Infrastructure Assessment, we looked at a few different sectors: waste management, energy, water, maybe transport should be the other one, and looked at sort of, you know, where the advantages and disadvantages were, where the targets were being made, and so I made the SDG targets, and how you know, sort of what projects would be needed to actually achieve the NDCs. And just checking, yeah, okay, just making sure there was another thing on the finance. So yeah, so this enabled a sort of prioritized pipeline of what infrastructure would be needed to go forward. And from there, we were able to develop the infrastructure financing strategy. So again, taking the pipeline, we were able to look at the various projects and expand on these projects to understand if they were carried out, what would be their key outputs, what would be, what would be the estimated cost, and also how they would contribute to SDGs and NDCs. And from there, we were able to use the Sustainable Infrastructure Financing Tool, which was developed by UNOPS. And basically it has a I guess you say a catalog of over 130 funds and sources of finance now, which focus on sustainable infrastructure. And so we're able to look through these funds, and actually the tool does it for us, and match projects that share similar sustainability criteria with those funds. So it's sort of, it's a bit of a matchmaking, but then it also goes further in terms of helping a government then know what it needs to provide these sort of applications for that funding. So it takes it a bit further, and so that has been that was delivered last year, and we're continuing with a bit of support to the national infrastructure, to the NIP in terms of asset management. Then we have another example, which is Ghana, and so Ghana, also a coastal nation. It has gold, cocoa, some oil, and Ghana has numerous challenges, and you know, the World Bank estimates that 1 million more people could fall into poverty due to climate shocks if urgent climate actions are not taken. And so this would be highly significant for Ghana. Environmental challenges, coastal erosion, loss of biodiversity, drought, flooding, crop failure, contamination of depletion of fresh water. It's just a really high level look at some of their major environmental challenges. And then, Ghana also has a climate change adaptation strategy, and looking at various components of their various sectors that they're looking at in terms of building resilience. Not too dissimilar from what we did with St. Lucia, we came into Ghana with the Global Center on Adaptation, as well as UNEP and the University of Oxford, working with the government of Ghana to do an adaptation investment roadmap, which would input into the NDCs and the NAP. We provide the sustainable infrastructure financing tool as an open source tool with data, and do some capacity building. And so, this whole process, involves an enormous amount of stakeholder engagement, 24 ministries, 119 individual stakeholders consulted, and lots of data sets and documents reviewed to input into this. And so this is where the University of Oxford largely leads with the NISMOD tool, looking at the exposure of the infrastructure, as well as how vulnerable and how many people would be affected by these, and therefore moving to, and this was across water, transport, and energy needs for the country. And out of that assessment, there were 35 priority investments, which were around nature-based solutions, capacity development, and physical projects. And then we also did the strategic financing approach, including the sources of finance. So just like we did for St. Lucia, we were able to match these priority projects with potential sources of funds. And one of the advantages to the SIFT tool is that we're able to identify funds that the governments weren't previously aware of, or had any sort of relationship with. So this roadmap for resilient infrastructure was launched this year in March, and so now we have some interested parties, the African Development Bank being one, in terms of taking some of the identified projects forward. I wanted to put in another one, the Tonga, which is basically about Tonga Tapu. So in terms of the island nation of Tonga, their capital is on the island of Tonga Tapu. And they had reached out to the Asian Development Bank and asked for support due to multiple hazards, as many of the Pacific Islands face, to understand how to plan going forward. They have a very high pressure on their population. I think there are 170 islands for Tonga. Most of them are not inhabited, but over 40 are. And a population of 100,000 people, but most of the people are migrating to the capital island for economic reasons, and so this is putting pressure on the capital to grow, but in an environment where there are a lot of hazards and sort of climate pressures on the island at the same time. So a multi-hazard risk assessment was carried out on the island to understand numerous hazards. It was earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, typhoons. They really get it from all directions there, and then from there they were able to really understand the context of the island in great detail. And this was also a social vulnerability analysis as well. And so some of the analysis, this is just a taste of it, was, it's about like, so if you have a 0.5 meter sea level rise. And so this is showing Tonga, Tapu divided down by districts. Then you can see, the total permanent loss across the different infrastructure. In the first column, then you can see what it means for buildings, then roads, and water assets, then power assets. And so, I mean, this is just one of the ways of mapping. But some of the things that they had to look at was that they were they were looking at reclaiming land in an area where basically there's sea level rise and sinking land. They were looking to reclaim some areas for luxury developments and things, and all of this was really important for them to understand how important spatial planning was. Another project that was connected to this was around an evacuation bridge over one of the sort of major waterways on the island. And it was assumed that this would be very beneficial for easing traffic, moving people, and especially in an emergency, this would be perhaps a link to higher ground. However, upon further analysis, I think just this year, they've understood that this probably wouldn't work the way they thought it would by using, pedestrian flow maps and other things. It turns out that while the need to cross the river is important as an evacuation bridge, it might not need that function. So very interesting use of this analysis. So those are just some examples of I think some places that are facing some pretty serious existential threats from climate and in some cases in many other hazards. So just going back, so we see this very much as something around quality infrastructure, so it's sustainable, resilient, and inclusive in these contexts. You can't really get away from any of those, and just emphasize on the inclusive. It's usually those who have the least means that are forced to live in some of the most exposed and hazardous areas. And so when we're building any infrastructure, it needs to be sustainable, resilient, and it needs to address the needs of the most vulnerable. And just to say that, our approach is very much about starting at the beginning. It's very much about starting at the highest level and looking at, the enabling environment and strategic planning to get these things right. It's about rezoning. It's about prioritizing projects before you go into these projects. And it sounds very, from a policy perspective, it sounds absolutely sensible. But in reality, almost all projects get funded and get looked at in development almost in isolation of their systems and higher strategic planning, globally speaking. And then in terms of resilient, what is resilient infrastructure, especially in the context of Guyana? So I said, in terms of this discussion that we can have, as I'm wrapping up now, I'm very interested that I saw a lot of sort of mention of resilient infrastructure and building infrastructure for adaptation for Guyana, but I didn't actually see it manifest itself in terms of projects that defined, what would resilience look like. What would I see projects for resilient roads, but I'm not sure what is meant by resilient roads in these contexts. And so I think there's a great opportunity there. And I think that if we look back to this, there are several bodies at the moment who agree around some points around resilient infrastructure. And part of this is about, failing safely. It is going to fail. How can it fail safely with the, least, if any, loss of life? The idea of adapting beyond its primary purpose. So this is pretty radical in terms of looking at infrastructure services from a different perspective. What else can they do besides their primary purpose? What can they do also after they failed? Being able to operate beyond foreseen human interventions, and to handle the variability of a changing environment. So not knowing what's going to happen, but be able to handle variability. So it's about working with uncertainty.